Yeah, good. It was raining in Sydney, so they had like half an hour of
I'll stand up.
Has everyone put their t-shirt on? I can see a few people not wearing t-shirts. Gee, how long does it take you guys to get dressed in the morning? Okay, so Luke's going to take a photo. Everyone smile.
Do we want to get people standing up?
Yeah, one standing up.
Everyone stand up. Hands in the air. Come on.
Look excited. Look like you're enjoying it.
All right, on the count of 3, everybody yell, IO extended. All right, 1, 2, 3. IO extended.
Okay, that's great.
On the count of 3, everybody dance like me.
Okay, so I'm going to introduce you to Andrew, who's a regular to our meetup, and he's going to talk about what's new in Android.
Brilliant, thank you, Mark. About 9 microphones staying, it's all a bit intimidating. Cool, so yeah, I'm going to talk about the bits that Katie missed because she was too busy partying. This is the actual information part of the evening. What I'll do is I'll put some slides on the meetup channel or whatever it is, so you can take photos if you want, but I'll make sure that Luke and the team have the slides. I've got YouTube links at the bottom so where you can find out more information about each of the topics I'm going to talk about. Obviously, condensing 3 days worth of Android talks, 63 sessions on Android alone into a 2-hour talk. I think we've only got 2 hours this evening. Isn't going to be easy, so we're going to go as fast as we can so you don't all fall asleep. So yeah, I'm going to cover off what's new in the Android platform, Android Studio, support library, material design, and a quick thing on Android things. So, Android P. Who knows what it's going to be called? These are my guesses. Peanut, popcorn, pineapple I'm hoping for. That's going to be quite cool. Pecan pie. And we'll talk app bundles, slices, actions, and all the things you can see on the screen there. First up, app bundles. These are kind of cool. I think they're already a thing on iOS, but app bundles are a publishing format. So this is a way that you can tell the Google Play Store how your app is broken into pieces. And those pieces might be what languages do you support, what images do you have for the different devices, densities, and the different native ARM and Intel libraries that you might be using. So you can click a checkbox in Android Studio to say, bundle up my app in this particular way, and then when the Play Store delivers your app to devices, it will only download the components that are needed for that specific device. So you can see here with the little nice animation on the left-hand side there, the old way of delivering APKs to a device includes all the languages. Even if you don't speak Russian, you're going to get the Russian language pack downloaded to your phone. Same as with if you've got an XHDPI device, why the heck do you need low-res images? So they're going to optimize the downloads based on the features of the device and the languages that are on the device. And this is going to use a technology called split APKs, which is something that was introduced in Lollipop, where they can build up your app using smaller chunks over time. If you're on pre-Lollipop, if you're targeting pre-Lollipop platforms, I feel your pain. But also, what they'll do is they're going to pre-build on the Play Store some APKs that are combinations of these different components with screen size and architecture already pre-built, so they'll have some smaller ones that can be downloaded on the fly. The really cool thing about this is, let's say you're an English speaker, so you've got English set up on your phone, but you've learned Portuguese on the weekend because that's the thing you want to do. What will happen is if you install Portuguese as an option on your device, the Play Store will go away and download the Portuguese language pack for any of the apps that you have that are using app bundles. So it'll go away and download in the background all the extra bits and pieces that you might need to support that language, which is kind of cool. Slices, next one. Slices are a great way, or a new way to have content in your app exposed remotely. So you may have already used things like content providers in the past, which allow you to expose content from your app outside of your app. And Slices builds upon that, so you're going to have a slice provider which sits on top of a content provider. Slices provide templated ways of showing content inside, at the moment, the Google search screen. So you might have an app that does weather, and somebody starts typing weather into the Google search bar in your device, and your app will go, oh, I know about weather, here is some weather for your location, and it will surface that into the results on the screen straight away. So this is great because you might not know which apps provide which functionality. You can just perform a search, and the ones that do know how to handle that request will suddenly surface information into the search results, which is quite good. And then if you see the bottom slide here, they're actually also interactive as well, so you can have media controls in there if you want to play trailers for a movie, or you want to deep link back into your app to kind of then launch into one of your activities to, for an Uber ride, for example, you can click in there and then it will launch Uber and away you go. So they're not available just yet, I think. There's a slice viewer that lets you test your slices, and they're only going to be surfaced in the search components at the moment. But you can imagine at later points you might be able to surface your content inside other apps, perhaps. So to set one up, we've got some code. I was going to make these bold because they were a bit hard to see yesterday, so hopefully you can read that. If you can't, there'll be some downloads later on for the PDFs. So in your manifest, you register your slice provider and say that it's a category type slice. In your slice provider, you extend one of the classes in the framework, and you have an on-bind slice, and then you kind of get the URI of what was typed in, and then you can say, okay, create me a slice based on that if you support that kind of functionality. And when you create your slice, you can use one of the builders that's provided by the slice framework to create one of those templated layouts that we saw on the previous slide. You populate some of the fields to populate the template, and you can then register some of the actions which call back into your app, so you can then deep link back into content. So pretty straightforward stuff, fairly easy to do, so it's one file, and hopefully with the actions you've already got deep links, so there's not too much extra effort to perform. App actions, another interesting feature that was added this year. So this allows your app to register as a handler of a common set of intents. So some of those intents might be play a game or get tickets. So if you're the Ticketek app or Ticketmaster, you might register to say, hey look, I'm an app that knows about how to buy tickets for things. And then when somebody starts searching here in the example, somebody's starting a query to stuff in Black Panther, you can see that your app here is going to be featured as, YouTube is going to say, well, you can watch a trailer for Black Panther, but your app might go, well, I can buy you tickets for Black Panther to go and see it at the movies. So these actions are going to appear again in the launcher or in the Google search, but they can also appear in the smart text selection. So if you're highlighting some text in a document, it might come up and say, well, I recognize this as a movie star's name, and one of the actions might be look up more information about this movie star using the IMDb app. So there'll be hooks into different parts of the app. Again, this is a developer preview, it's coming soon, so you can register at the URL there and start playing around with that soon. And to set up this one, it's only a single XML file to add the actions to your application. So here we've got one for a sort of an Uber style app. So at the top there you might see that we've registered an intent for the order ride action. This is one of the predefined ones. You can actually set up custom ones. You can give it a display name, so when it appears in the list you can say order ride. You can specify a URL template, so this is the URL that's going to be called when the user clicks on your entry in the search results. Now this can go to a website if you want to start http://blah.com.au, or if you've got a custom schema for your app. In this case, we've got Uber : so it's going to kind of try and launch the Uber app. We can have some placeholders in the URL for dropping off and picking up, and then further down we can have some parameters that map what you would kind of call dropping off and picking up to the system known entities. Here we've got drop off location.address and pick up location.address, so that's going to map to an address, and you're going to receive those parameters on the URL. And again, in the same way that you process deep links, you can then process this request and launch the action, and away you go. So pretty straightforward stuff. Cutout. I'm not legally allowed to call them notches. They're notches. And there's 4 different ways that you can support cutouts, not notches, on Android. So there's a window layout in display cutout mode, a very easy to remember parameter name that you can specify in your manifest file. So going top to bottom, left to right. So number 1 is never support notches. So what you'll find there is you'll get like a black bar that hides the notch across the top, and your app will sit underneath the notch. Number 2, which is the default, you'll get the status bar sitting behind the notch in the same way that you've seen on maybe the Essential phone. So you get the time and stuff out the side and the battery power. The 2 more bottom ones are the more interesting ones. You can say I want to support on the short edges. So in the first case you can say get me the safe insets, which will return you sort of a giant rectangle saying, look, somewhere in here there is a notch, you draw your stuff below this rectangle and you'll be fine. So you go, okay, brilliant, there you go. But if you specify short edges, you can also query what are the exact bounds, or what's the smallest rectangle available that shows me where the notch is positioned, and then you can see the little red rectangle here, so you can say, okay, that's the area where the notch is, I'm not going to draw anywhere inside that, I can draw all my content around it, and that's going to be sort of the best user experience possible, making the most of the screen real estate. So those are the 4 different ways you can support it. Another kind of cool feature that was announced is Image Decoder. This is it's only announced as part of the framework, so it's not in the support library yet. It's because it uses native code, I believe, under the hood to provide the extra kind of cool features. It was only touched upon briefly, but there was a talk that I went to in Chicago by Jake Warden, who hopefully everybody knows because he's quite famous in doing things like retrofit and a whole lot of other Android framework libraries, Picasso being one of the image loading libraries you may have used. So Image Decoder is like a new memory-efficient way of decoding images inside your Android apps. So previously you might have used Bitmap Factory decode stream, and you'd pass in some options saying, okay, actually I only want to get the header information here to work out the size. I don't want to do some calculations to work out, okay, this is the size of the image, I want to resize it down to the size of my view, and then you decode the image again with that kind of scaling factor, saying, oh, take the image and scale it by a factor of 3, and then you're not having a large bitmap in memory. That means you have to have 2 kind of scaling operations and decoding operations of the bitmap. Not cool. So with the image decoder, you have a data source, which is your image. You can then query attributes of that multiple times, and it doesn't allocate new versions of that image. So you're going to save a lot on memory. It also supports like a decoding pipeline. So rather than having to decode things twice, you can say, give me the header information, do some calculations on the header information, then give me the body of the image, knowing what I know already. So you can then process things in a far more efficient way. You can also do post-processing on the image. So once you've processed the image, you've read it from the network or the disk, you can then say, okay, look, it's a profile picture. What I'm going to do is put the name of the person over the top. So rather than having to have like a text view over the top of the image, you get given a canvas, and you can just write using the Canvas API the name of the person in the profile photo, if that's your use case. It supports animated GIFs, which a lot of the Bitmap Factory stuff doesn't support. If you're using the Glide library for downloading images, that supports animated GIFs. I don't think Picasso does. But one of the things that Jake mentioned in this talk in Chicago is Picasso 3.0 is underway. It's being worked on right now, and Image Decoder is one of the big features that are going to leverage inside that framework. So sometime, hopefully this year, they were talking about maybe releasing it. You should be able to see greater improvements on Android P devices for processing images and saving memory and stuff like that. If you're not on an Android P device, you still have to use the old way until they come out with a support library version. But for going forward, this is a sort of a huge step. AR Core and Sceneform. I didn't go to a lot of these talks because I was doing more of the sort of hardcore Android bits and pieces. But AR Core is now supported in the emulator. So if you're doing, if you're running on the emulator and you kind of launch your AR app, you're going to get a sort of pre-rendered scene that you can kind of walk around. It's like a lounge room with some sofas and chairs and things like that. You can render your content inside this virtual room, so you don't have to actually walk around your office physically clicking on buttons. You can actually do it all from your desktop, which is handy for testing things. Sceneform, if anybody's ever done any OpenGL code, you'll know it's a pain in the ass, pardon my language. And there's a lot of boilerplate code that you have to write to get just a circle on the screen. You have to define lights and normals and all this kind of stuff to make it look like a proper sphere. Sceneform is a scene graph, so it kind of abstracts the underlying OpenGL code into something that's more easily programmable. You talk about spheres and objects and materials and all this kind of stuff, and it makes creating 3D scenes a lot easier. So Sceneform is Google's first venture into this space in terms of making it easier for you to create the 3D objects that you want to put inside your 3D, inside your AR applications. So this little graphic on the right-hand side, we've got like an animated solar system thing happening where the sun and the moon and the planets are orbiting around each other. And there's also a plugin for Android Studio where you can sort of edit and view your models as you're kind of developing your app, which is kind of cool too. So the deprecation policy, so there was a blog post earlier this year, December 2017 according to the link, where Google mentioned that they're going to start deprecating, forcing you to target newer versions of the APIs. They want to kind of move the platform forward. They want people to support the newer features. They want people to support things like picture-in-picture mode, resizable windows, all that kind of stuff. Android apps can now run on Chromebooks, so you can have windows that can be horizontal, vertical, portrait, landscape, all that kind of stuff. If you're still locking your apps to landscape or portrait, shame on you, bad person, because it's not going to work on Chromebooks and stuff going forward, so people are going to get annoyed with that. So to that end, if you're releasing a new app, as of August this year, you're going to have to target API 26 if you want it to upload into the Play Store. If you're updating an existing app, from November onwards, you're going to have to target API 26 and above as well. And these are going to change over time. So from the target API, you can imagine it's going to go to 27 at some point next year, 28 towards the end of next year, 29 whatever in the future. So they want to drive the platform forward and make sure people are using the latest features to support the most number of devices. And again, if you've got native code inside your application, you'll need to support 64-bit versions of that native code from August 2019 with 32-bit optional. So if you're doing any of that kind of stuff, make sure you're doing that. One of the other things that was it wasn't a shock, but it was like an interesting, why have they done this? You won't be able to call private or hidden APIs anymore if you're targeting Android P. So if you're doing some reflection under the hood to change the colors dynamically on your bottom navigation bar because there's a method inside that does that, but it isn't exposed publicly, and you want to kind of, as you're tapping through the bottom navigation, change the colors of bits and pieces, it's going to crash. So don't do it. It's basically Google's policy. If you are genuinely having problems with stuff that's crashing and you believe it's a legitimate use case, saying, look, I need to change this and this is the reason why, you can get in touch with Google. You can say, look, please don't kill this one, and they actually look at that and turn it from a private API into a public API. So if enough people put their hand up and say, look, this really needs to be a feature, they're going to add that in. But yeah, so you can expect runtime crashes if you're trying to do some under the hood nasty stuff in the future. One of the other things that was kind of it wasn't specifically around Android, but there was a big theme this year about digital well-being. Put down your phone, stop being on Twitter at 2 in the morning. Go outside, have fun, talk to your friends, meet people, all that kind of thing. So to that end, inside Android P, you're going to start seeing things like there's going to be a dashboard inside the operating system, which is going to tell you how long you've been using your device, how long you spend within each app. You can set timers and say, look, I only want to be able to use YouTube, or for the kids, maybe for an hour a day. And when they get to the end of that hour, the icon's going to go grey. You're not going to be able to use it until the next window comes along. So they're trying to get people off their phones, like this poor gentleman here and his rather expensive-looking pillow, sleeping in bed, tweeting his friends with the most perfectly manicured beard you've ever seen in your life. They call it wind down mode, so it kind of kicks in at 10 o'clock, I think is the default, but you can change it via the assistant. it's going to switch on Do Not Disturb, so you're not going to get any notifications anymore, and it's going to slowly fade the screen to grayscale. So if you're watching YouTube videos and you're wondering why this looks a bit weird, it's because the Do Not Disturb mode is going to kick in, and basically put down your phone, go to sleep. You're annoying your partner who's already asleep next to you. So next, Android Studio. So that was kind of Android P, what's in the framework. So Android Studio, we're going to talk about some of the development tool bits and pieces. Android Studio got updated to IntelliJ 2018.2. So if you're using, I think beta 16, no, Android 3.2, yeah, is up to that one now. And they announced the graded plugin for 3.16, I think yesterday or today. And we're going to cover ConstraintLayout, MotionLayout, and all the other good stuff. ConstraintLayout 2.0 is my new favourite goodness for creating layouts. I've done talks on this other things. I think I did one at the DevFest last year here, if you saw that one. It's a really great way of laying out your widgets on the screen. It's really flexible. It kind of takes its cues from a auto layout, I think it was called on iOS, but there's a well-known algorithm which both of these are based upon. So 2.0 is going to add in some helpers. You're probably already using helpers at the moment if you're using guidelines and barriers inside your constraint layouts. These are helpers, and they've now exposed the API so you can create your own helpers. Helpers are sort of a general reference. They're not a view group per se, in that they don't wrap a series of views, but you can get references to a group of views and then apply some common attributes to those. It might be setting the alpha channel to 0, or setting the visibility to gone, whatever it might be. There's going to be some helpers provided out of the bag, some new ones that are coming along. So linear helper is the first one they talk about. So if you're using chains to kind of link multiple widgets in a horizontal or vertical chains, they space out nice and evenly across your screen. There's going to be a linear helper that's going to take away some of the nastiness of having to reference each one, referencing the one next to it in the chain. It kind of gets a bit cumbersome over time. So this is going to make creating chains very easy, very similar to how you have maybe a linear layout currently in your layouts. So here, the little code snippet in the middle there, you just reference the 3 buttons that you want to be in this linear layout, and it's going to do all the chains and stuff behind the scenes, which is going to kind of cut away some of the boilerplate code, which is great. Flow helper, if you've ever used a sort of flexbox layout stuff, there's a library for that on Android already. It's kind of a popular JavaScript way of laying out stuff on the screen. If you've got stuff that needs to wrap automatically onto a second or third line as the content grows, Flow helper is going to let you do that kind of stuff as well. Layers are quite interesting. They're a way of kind of grouping views and then applying like a common background to them. You can almost kind of think of them maybe like a Photoshop layer. If you're kind of doing some kind of artwork, you might have different layers, and you can lock views into a particular layer, so you can then rotate all of those views as a group. In this little example here on the top left, we've got 6 buttons created as a layer, and then that layer has a background, so it automatically knows where the boundaries are for those 6 buttons, and then you say apply the blue border, and it's going to draw a blue border around them as well. And circular reveal. So the bottom right here on the animation, circular reveals is one of the Android sort of material design niceties to have when you're building apps. When you click on a button, you want content to be revealed magically to the user. Here you can just specify, look, this is my circular reveal. These are the 3 widgets I want to reveal when my button is clicked, or whatever it might be, and it will automatically perform the reveal for you. The 4 buttons across the bottom, which are outside of this reference, they're not part of the circular reveal, are not included, and obviously they kind of overlap, so they're always visible. So it's a very easy way of having the circular reveal on just a few specific components, and the other ones are kind of left to themselves, which is sometimes quite tricky. So if you're doing constraint layout stuff at the moment, you might be using constraint sets to do animations. Constraint sets are a great way of having sort of a before and an after look and feel. You might have a summary screen where you've got a few details about a thing. You click on a button on that screen, the widgets move around to reveal more details about those items. That's a very easy thing to set up in constraint layout. You basically have a start and an end position, and it will animate all the widgets between those 2 states. The only downside is it's quite cumbersome. You have to duplicate a lot of the constraints in 2 places. So what they're going to do for constraint layout 2.0 is pull that constraint information out into sort of a separate XML file, which is your constraint layout states file. In this example here, you can see we've got 2 states which are referenced. The boilerplate code to do this animation and switch between the 2 is quite lengthy. With this new XML abstraction, it's going to turn into one line of code. You go, I want to see the summary version of this screen, and it's going to go boom, there's the summary. I want to see the detailed version, rather than having to copy and clone different constraint sets and apply them to the root objects of your hierarchy and stuff, which is a pain to do. The other great thing about these constraint layout states is you can specify a DP size with them. So if you can imagine on the Chromebook, this is going to be extremely useful. So as you're resizing the window on your app, because remember, you're not locking it to portrait mode anymore, you can resize the window. It can go from portrait to landscape, it can go from big to small, and these different layouts are automatically going to be applied at the different size boundaries that you've specified in this XML file. So if you override the onConfiguration changed method in your activity, you can also apply things like a transition manager. So you can say, actually, I want to animate these changes. So it's not going to just snap from having things listed horizontally to vertically. You can actually animate those things so they'll transition really nicely as you're resizing the windows, getting a very kind of smooth experience. Again, you can do it on the phone if you're rotating from landscape to portrait. You can do a similar kind of animation transition between the different states, which is kind of cool.
It has constraint sets.
Oh,
it has untouched keyframes, custom attributes.
Yeah, so this is the video from the thing. I forgot to turn the sound off the video.
With a little flag on your device, you can see the path of all the objects
Ignore the sound.
So
MotionLayout is a great way of managing the layouts. The animation of different components.
Should match the custom frame. It has
so here you can see we're animating this one layout.
It has constraint sets. It has untouched keyframes, custom attributes.
From horizontal to vertical.
With a little flag on your device, you can see the path of all the objects. You can see by your device.
Little filter will go through the middle of that information button. We don't really want that in this particular case.
Should match the custom frame.
It has. So what you can do is you can add a keyframe. You can set have a third state in the middle and say, look,
it has
when we're halfway through
constraint sets. It has untouched keyframes, custom attributes.
And what will happen is the MotionLayout will actually interpolate a path between the start and
with a little flag on your device, you can see the path of all the objects. All the path. You can see by your device. Little film with
that these widgets will be taking as it transitions through the keyframes.
Should match the custom frame. It has constraint sets. It has untouched key.
So this is kind of what it looks like in Android Studio. The version this is available in isn't out yet. So across the bottom there, you've got a row of about 8 or 9, I think it is, buttons from top to bottom. The pink little dots that you might be able to see, those are the keyframes that have been set up for those different views. And as the blue vertical bar scrubs from left to right, that's your timeline, you can see the widgets animate on the screen at the top there. So this is very similar to how your Android settings kind of scrolls down in the notification shade, and the different keyframes there mean that they can go top to bottom, side to side without kind of clashing with each other. So it's very easy to set up. When you want to get to a keyframe point, you just move the scrubber to the point on the timeline, you click on the widget, you move it on the screen to where it should be at that particular point in the animation, and the MotionLayout just does the rest. So a really great way, or easy way, to set up some smooth animations that we've long been sort of looking for in Android. Navigation editor is the next one. Fragments are back. For those people who are going, fragments are rubbish. Custom views are the way forward. Bad news. Fragments are really cool. They've always been really cool. They've just been kind of underutilized. So hopefully you're still using fragments in your apps. And one of the things that Navigation Editor is going to do is going to allow you to abstract the way navigation works from being sort of hard-coded within your code into an external XML file. This XML file can be managed through a visual tool, which you can see on the screen here. And using the editor, you can choose from your suite of fragments that make up your app and say, okay, this is the one for the start screen, this is the one for the next screen, this is the one for the summary screen, this is the one You can just draw lines between them very simply in the editor to say this is the flow between my app and the different states of my app. The really cool thing about this is because we've now removed the sort of hard-coded version of the navigation from the app, it makes it more testable. You can kind of test things in isolation. You can test the navigation by itself without having to load up your entire app. One of the other things which I won't mention more than this is the type-safe arguments. So rather than just having, here's the bundle, there might be some information in there that the next activity or the next fragment cares about. You're going to have type-safe stuff. So if you put something in as a string, you're going to get it back out as a string. You're not going to have to sit there and go, was it a string or was it a serializable or was it an int? I don't know. It was a number, but it was inside some quotes. It could be anything. It's going to be type-safe, so you're not going to get parameters going missing very easily. It's going to handle up and back correctly. Anybody actually understand how up and back works? I certainly don't. It's going to make this is going to magically fix everything. But the other really cool thing about this is if you've got a deep link into one of the fragments of your activity of your application as a deep link, what it's going to do is it's automatically going to synthesize the backstack. So when you click on the deep link and go into the application, hitting the back button, you don't want the app to actually just quit straight away. You actually want to go from your item screen, maybe back to your category screen, then back to your home page. It's going to create that backstack for you so that when you deep link in, hitting back is going to do the right thing, not the wrong thing. So it's going to do that for you as well, which has always been a pain to use the backstack manager, I think it was called, hierarchy manager. So yes, and you can also use this to update not just a whole screen, but a part of the screen. So you might click on a button and have the bottom section change from something to something else. You can do that through the navigation editor as well. So under the hood, this is the file that the navigation editor creates. So you can see here that we've got a start destination highlighted, which is going to be fragment number 1. There's a reference, there's a reference there to fragment number 1 where you can see that it's called first fragment. You can specify the layout file that fragment is going to use. That layout file, if you're using cool stuff like ConstraintLayout, it's going to render that inside the editor as well, so you get a great visual representation of how your app is going to look and how you're going to move between it. Yep, that's that slide there. And then there's an action. So as you draw a link from fragment 1 to fragment 2, it's going to say, look, at some point there's going to be an action on this screen that's going to take you to the second screen. This action is then going to be something you can reference inside your code to say, perform this transition, and it's the XML file that's going to go, oh, I know that I need to launch activity fragment number 2 now. So inside your activity main.xml file, if you've got one of these for your layouts, traditionally you might have had a frame layout where you just kind of replace or add fragments to it programmatically. What you need to do now is you need to have a nav host fragment. This is then going to have a reference to your XML file that contains your navigation information, and then as you switch between the different fragments based on the actions using the API in the navigation manager, this fragment host is going to switch in your fragments for you, so it makes transitioning between fragments really easy. The other cool thing, so you might have noticed in the navigation example there that the screens themselves looked quite nice. The reason that they had lots of data in there, they looked more like what they were going to be when you launch the app on a real device. The reason that's working quite well is because of sample data. So these are design time pieces of information that you can add to your widgets to make them look more like what they're going to be when you actually launch it onto a device. Which is great for when you want to sit down with a designer perhaps, you've got the Android Studio version of your layout, you've plugged in some sample data, the designer sits next to you and goes, yeah, that looks pretty good, rather than just seeing a list view or a recycler view with numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, showing that there's going to be 9 elements in that thing. You go, could look like anything. So this is really kind of cool. So some of the built-in sample data that you get is for things like images, text, colors, dates. You can have first names, US cities, the lorem ipsum thing. You can specify how many words that you want from that. You can have some avatars. So you get some nice pre-rendered, cartoonish kind of style images. And to reference those inside your text views, you just use the app tools animation, annotation, and then sample the sample data that you want to pull in. You can set up some custom data as well, so if the ones that are provided don't really match your use case, you can provide your own. There's a menu inside Android Studio to create a new sample data directory. Essentially it's just going to be a directory called sample data, so you can really do it by hand. So in this example here we've got a file called app sample data custom file. Inside this file you can just have a list. It's just a text file, you can put anything you want in there, whether it be names, cats, dogs, pets, whatever it might be. you can use that then inside like a recycler view, and as each row is rendered, it will just pull another record or another row from your text file and apply that to the information on the screen. Again, if you want something a bit more fancy, you can have background images, so you can point a folder full of PNGs or JPEGs or WebP at the annotation, and it will just pull out the next image from that folder. So you can have, if you're doing an app that's doing landscapes from around the world, you can have some pre-done landscapes for your testing purposes, which is kind of cool. And if you're heavily using some JSON data or JSON data, you can have a JSON data file, and you can then reference specific attributes within that as well. Cool, next up, halfway through, maybe close to halfway through, past halfway, we'll go quicker. Support library, now called Jetpack. The animation goes a lot quicker. Yes, they renamed it, and along with renaming it, they refactored all the packages. So yeah, Android Jetpack contains a lot of the things that you already are using, because it's the support library by a different name. So you should be able to notice these fragments here, you've got transitions, layout, palette, multi-dex, app compat, you should be using all those. The architecture components on the top left there, hopefully you're using some of those lifecycle aware bits and pieces as well. And the ones that I mentioned flagged as new, so navigation we've talked about, paging I'm not going to cover today because it's a big topic and there's a lot of slides and not enough time. WorkManager we'll cover in a little bit as well. So hopefully all that's very familiar to you. They've also repackaged all the names for the different support library components. So previously you might have had fragments from the V7 package or the recycler view from sort of V13 or whatever it might be, or view pager. Who knows what V4 and V7 and V13 means, it's all crazy. So they've got rid of that, which is great. So anything that starts Android dot now is going to be a framework package, something that comes with the actual Android framework. It's not going to be updated particularly often. Anything that starts Android X is going to be unbundled from the platform, and that's going to be the stuff that's going to be delivered through this kind of regular support library mechanisms, or Jetpack mechanisms, as I should now call them. If you want to convert your existing app from the old stuff to the new stuff, there is a refactor menu in the, I think it was released in beta 14 of the Android Studio version 3.2, but beta 15 fixed a whole load of bugs, so that's the latest version I think you can download, which is cool. Here's some examples of what the old and new used to look like for those who care. But the great thing as well about this refactoring and changing of the name, they've made each of the dependencies more fine-grained. So you're not going to get big chunks of code coming down when you just want to use the recycler view. There is a recycler view Jetpack dependency that you can install. If there is a bug fix to that or a new version, you only need to pull down the recycler view stuff. You don't need to change the one for the fragments. You don't need to change the one for the WorkManager, which is really kind of cool. So you only have to change the things that need changing. The downside is every single one of these things is going to be versioned individually. So you're going to have 1.0 of recycler view, you're going to have 1.3 of WorkManager, you're going to have 2.0 of slices. It's going to get quite hairy. So unless Google come up with some kind of giant web page matrix of what the latest versions are, it could get quite confusing. Probably today you might be in your build.graver going, I'm using support library 26.2.2, and then you just import all the things for that same version number. That's going to kind of change going forward. The version numbers have also been reset back to 1.0, so 28.0 is going to be like the last version of the support library. 1.0 is the first version of the Jetpack library. They are going to be the same. So 1.0 and 28 are the same. There isn't going to be a 29. It's going to be 1.1, 1.2 going forward. So they've reset all the version numbers as well. WorkManager is really kind of cool. If you're doing background work that needs to be done at some point in the future, but you need to guarantee that it gets done, WorkManager is going to be your friend. If you've used Job Scheduler or the Evernote Work Scheduler, I think it's called, this is the new hotness from Google. It guarantees it will do some work at the future based on conditions that you can set about that piece of work. It's backwards compatible. It works with or without Google Play services being on the device. It's queryable, which is something you can't do with Job Scheduler at the moment. You can't say, what is the status of this job? You just have to fire and forget. And the other cool thing is it's chainable, so you can have multiple items of work, and the subsequent ones can depend on the first one, and they'll execute in order or in parallel, depending on how you set it up. So let's see a quick example of that. Hopefully the code is readable for people at the back. You specify a worker, which does some work, as you would imagine. In this example, it's going to do some compression of some images, perhaps, or whatever. You return the success status of that works, or you can say retry later, or you can say no, it failed miserably. You specify some constraints, so you can say I want this job to run when the device is idle and is charging. You can say, look, I want it to run when it's connected to Wi-Fi, or when there's in a particular geolocation, I think. And then you can apply those constraints to the piece of work and say this is going to run once, or whether it's going to run periodically, and then you queue this work with the WorkManager and then just forget about it. And at some point in the future, it will execute and your job will be done. The cool thing, as I mentioned, you can chain stuff together. So in the top example there, we begin with work item A. When that finishes successfully, we'll go on to work item B. And then when that finishes successfully, we'll go on to work item C. They'll be executed in order, not in parallel. In the bottom example, you can say we're going to begin with work item A, 1, 2, and 3. They're going to run in parallel. So it doesn't matter what order they run in. They might be compressing individual sets of images or doing some bits and pieces like that. When all those have finished, work item B is then going to be executed. That might be uploading those images to a server. And then work item C and 1 and 2 are going to execute in parallel. Again, that might be writing some logs or something crazy like that. So you can run stuff in parallel or in serial, and you can depend on one or the others. And each of those work items can have different sets of constraints. So the parallel example, it might be I'm going to compress some images, so I need to be charging because I'm going to use a whole lot of battery power to do some workhorse kind of stuff. Then work B might be doing the upload, so that might have a different set of constraints based on being connected to Wi-Fi and stuff. So you don't all have to have the same constraints. Cool. Getting to the end. Kotlin extensions for Android. Android KTX was announced late last year, early this year, I believe. It optimizes Jetpack and Android stuff for use in Kotlin, which is everybody's using Kotlin. Who's not using Kotlin? Shame. No, it's all good, it's all good. It's shame. It's not just a single library, it's lots of multiple libraries, so there's a lot of extensions for each of the different bits and pieces that I mentioned earlier in the Jetpack library. So you're going to have fragment Kotlin extensions, you're going to have collection Kotlin extensions, you can have SQLite Kotlin extensions. So if you're using Kotlin, you only need to download the ones that are relevant to the Jetpack libraries that you're already using. So again, smaller amounts of code included inside your final APK. So Jake Wharton, who did this talk, goes through a lot of the rationale behind which things make it into the Kotlin extensions library, why do they choose some things and not other things, which is a really great rationale about if I'm writing a Kotlin extension myself, what sort of guidelines should I be following. So that's a really great opening part of his talk. But the second part of his talk is around building Kotlin-friendly libraries. So if you're working on a library, maybe it's an internal one just to your organization, or maybe it's a public one on GitHub, what are the things that you can do to, if it's already an existing Java library, what can you do to make it Kotlin-friendly? So his 3 points are: 1, rewrite it in Kotlin, which may or may not work because then you might lose compatibility with some of the features that people in the Java space need or can lose out on. You can ship a sibling library, so as well as having the Java version of your library, you just build another version which is written in Kotlin and makes use of the Kotlin specific language features. Not great because now you've got code in 2 places. Or the third option, which is the better option, there's this proposal called Keep 110, and it's a set of annotations that you can apply to your code that says, look, here is some ways that I want you to expose the features of the language so that Kotlin can users get the benefit, but not at the expense of Java people using this library. So it gives you a single source of truth for your library. You've only got one set of code that you need to write, and you get the features you get the extra features in Kotlin if you're a Kotlin person, but you can still use it from Java. This is a proposal at the moment. I believe he has a link in his talk about where you can go and star this proposal to say, yes, this is a really good idea. Please make it a thing. So yes, hopefully that will happen going forward. So those are some options if you're a library builder and you want to target Kotlin. Finally, here we go, last 2 sections. Material design. So as Craig mentioned earlier, there's a whole lot of material design, material theming talks at Google I/O this year, and we'll cover some of those bits and pieces here. Material theming is like an evolution of material design. We want to escape the world where all material design apps look the same. It's a richer set of components, so you can have diamond-shaped fabs if you want to have that. You can have buttons with kind of cuts coming out of the corners, kind of cool stuff. It's cross-platform, as Craig mentioned. It's available for Flutter, iOS, web, and Android. And there's a strong kind of brand focus. Google did speak a little bit about, you don't necessarily have to make your Android apps Android-y and your iOS apps iOS-y anymore. If you've got a strong brand, let's say you're Australia Post, you want things to be red, go with red on both platforms. Stay true to some of the platform quirks, but don't necessarily have to look like all the other material design apps and necessarily the other ones that are shipped with the platform. To help you with that, Sketch, there's a whole lot of plugins for Sketch. If you're a Sketch user, you can then theme your bits and pieces through that. Your designers are going to love this. It's really kind of cool. I'm going quickly because Luke's pointing at his wrist. And then material design components. So these are, it's an open source library. These are implementations of the material design theming stuff. So you're going to get like material button, material text view, all this kind of stuff, where you can then apply the material design guidelines more easily. And you can drag these widgets in to your project. As Craig again mentioned, Flutter team sits next to the material design team, so the Flutter stuff has all the widgets right now. Android and iOS are playing catch up at the moment, but it's open source, so you can submit stuff if you wanted to. Finally, Android things, last slide I believe. Yeah, last slide, go back. And so Android things, I didn't see an awful lot of talk about Android things. There was maybe a couple of sessions which I didn't go to, but they announced version 1.0 just before Google I/O, and in that kind of rundown, they announced what is in 1.0. So if you're doing any Android stuff, Android things related stuff, you can now control and monitor the over-the-air updates via the console, which you couldn't do before. There's enhanced Bluetooth API support for state management. You can now connect your devices to low-powered Wi-Fi personal area networks or something, so you can make them talk to each other in a mesh. And you can also extend the existing frameworks with your own custom hardware. So let's say you've written a super cool new location discovery beacon widget thing with some electronics. You can actually have that through a user driver exposed through the system services that the Android framework will then use. Last slide, boom, done.
We've got time for one question while
one
Dan
question? Oh god.
sets up. So
make it an easy one. Matt's at the back in the hat.
Yep.